I'm Dan Palazzolo. I'm the professor of political science and a co-director of the Gary L. McDowell Institute, along with my colleague Terry Price, who's seated up front. And we're pleased to welcome you here for our last lecture of the academic year. As many of you know, the McDowell Institute is dedicated to the values of the namesake, who's Professor Gary L. McDowell. We support free inquiry, thoughtful deliberation, and rigorous discussion of classical texts and contemporary issues. The Institute welcomes all members of the university community and a wide range of political perspectives. Earlier today and yesterday, for instance, our speaker met with 4 groups of student fellows of the McDowell Institute to engage in a thoroughgoing discussion of religion and religious belief. The student fellows are seated up front along with their discussion leaders, Dr. Kevin Cherry, Dr. Eric Kraft, Dr. Jess Flanagan, and Dr. Lydia Roddy. Would our fellows and discussion leaders please stand so we can acknowledge your contributions to the McDowell Institute? Thank you. The programs of the McDowell Institute would not be possible without the support of administrative leaders, members of our Board of Advisors, McDowell Institute staff, and our contributors. We'd like to recognize and thank Dr. Sandra Peart, the Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and members of our Board of Advisors, several of whom are with us tonight, Brenda McDowell, Ron Crutcher, and Jeff Sedgwick, for their support of the McDowell Institute. We also deeply appreciate the day-to-day operational support, innovation, and creativity of our program coordinator, Heidi Thompson, who's in the back. Always deserving of applause. She's done an outstanding job of coordinating all aspects of this event. Finally, we'd like to thank the friends and supporters of the Institute, the Pauley Family Foundation, the Endeavor Legacy Foundation, and anonymous contributors for their generous gifts, which make our programs possible. Just 2 program notes before we begin. Once Mr. Douthat completes his remarks, there should be enough time for questions, beginning with our students. And after the Q&A, Dr. Sandra Peart of the Jepson School will close our proceedings and invite you to a reception following the program. Now, please welcome the University Chaplain, Dr. Craig Coker, who will take a moment to properly introduce Mr. Douthat. Greg?
Thank you, Dan. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for the evening, Mr. Ross Douthat. Mr. Douthat is a New York Times columnist who writes about politics, culture, and religion. He recently began hosting a New York Times opinion podcast called Interesting Times. He also serves as a film critic for the National Review and as visiting lecturer at Yale Law School. Prior to his current position with the Times, he was senior editor of The Atlantic. He is a graduate of Harvard College. Mr. Douthat is the author of several books, including Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, and a memoir of his personal struggle with chronic Lyme's disease called The Deep Places, a memoir of illness and discovery. His latest book is Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious, a book that the Gary McDowell Fellows have been discussing with their faculty mentors in recent weeks, in which Mr. Douthat discussed over the past couple of days. I had the good fortune of being a part of a lunch this afternoon where we discussed not just religious ideas, but the religious experience of being a young adult, which Mr. Douthat speaks to as well. Ross also grew up as a diehard Boston Red Sox fan, something he has in common with our university president, Kevin Halleck. You may know that today is opening day in Major League Baseball. And Ross, you may want to know that the Red Sox and Reds are playing right now in Cincinnati, and the score is 0-0 in the top of the 4th. So, batter up. Will you please welcome Ross Douthat to the University of Richmond.
How do I sound? Good, excellent, all right. Thank you so much, Chaplain, for that incredibly kind introduction, and I'm incredibly grateful to all of you for being here tonight, and I'm incredibly grateful to the McDowell Institute for having me for this, what has been a ruthless and grueling 36 hours of intense scrutiny from some of the brightest young minds in America, in which I have been repeatedly raked over the coals, sometimes metaphorically and sometimes literally. There were some inquisitors who appeared. It's very strange. You know, we've covered the problem of evil, the existence of hell, you know, the history and nature of the Crusades, interreligious dialogue, sex, marriage, when you should marry your college girlfriend, basically every topic under the sun. I regret to inform you that I'm now completely exhausted. I've forgotten everything that I ever knew about religion, politics, America, and my own last name. But I can assure you that the Institute is in good hands, and the youth are remarkable, and you know, you should all be very happy and gratified by that intelligence. So have a good night. Thank you. No. So I'm going to talk about some of the themes from my latest book, which is the book that the students read and engaged with and argued with, which has a kind of exhortatory title, Believe Why Everyone Should Be Religious. But rather than just sort of giving a summary of the book's arguments, I'm going to try and place them in the middle of a larger discussion that tries to sort of talk about where we are as a culture right now in our relationship to religion, religious practice, institutional religion, church-going, and so on. So I've been a columnist at the New York Times now for 15 or 16 years, which is a remarkable span of time. And I was hired by the newspaper very much as a religious conservative, with the idea being that, you know, Ross Douthat, Roman Catholic and conservative, would be a good person to sort of represent the ideas and arguments behind religion and religious belief to an audience that is, you know, extremely diverse. The New York Times has a wonderfully diverse and vast and complex audience, but it is fair to say that it perhaps skews just slightly in a secular and liberal direction. And when I took the job, I was very optimistic that, you know, I would be the man to convince secular America that the time had come to fall on its collective knees and, you know, get right with the Lord, and that my hiring was actually going to be sort of a touchstone for a broader religious revival in America. This is what I told my wife, and she was unpersuaded, but I was very hopeful. That was not, in fact, the moment and the world into which I entered this particular set of professional obligations. The world that I entered was a world in which American Christianity and American religion and religious practice writ large were in trouble and were entering a period of decline, retreat, and disillusionment. And this trend had a lot of different causes. Some of them were sort of structural, sociological, and economic. In part, you can understand the retreat from religion as connected to the larger retreat from all kinds of institutions in America. The decline of churches has gone hand in hand with the decline of bowling leagues and Elks Lodges and marriage rates and family formation. The decline in trust in religious institutions is connected to the decline in trust in political institutions and academic institutions, right? So in that way, it's part of a larger story, but then there's also certain kind of concrete religion-specific elements at work, right? So, you know, as I said, I'm Catholic, and when I took the job at the Times, all of the sex abuse scandals in my own church were very much in the news, dominating headlines, sort of creating a constant internal agony for Roman Catholicism. We've seen similar periods of scandal in other Christian churches and religious denominations over this time. I also joined the Times at a moment when America had had an evangelical Christian president, George W. Bush, who was profoundly associated with religious conservatism, and his presidency was seen to have ended in failure. He left office incredibly unpopular. Barack Obama was elected president as sort of the embodiment of a new and youthful progressivism that led, I think, a lot of people to imagine a future and maybe even sort of embrace a future in which conservative religion, at least, was supposed to belong to the political and cultural past. And then you had a wave of very specific cultural figures, the so-called new atheists, people like Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens and many others who sort of entered into public debate in a kind of pugnacious, anti-religious, anti-God style and won a lot of converts. And so if you look at the overall trends that came out of this moment for about 10 years after I joined the Times, the story year after year tended to be the same. Every year, fewer Americans identified with a church or a religious or a denomination. Church-going rates diminished. The younger generation was less likely to be religious than older generations. And you had the rise of what gets called the nuns, which from a Catholic perspective are not the good kind of nuns, N-U-N-S, but people with no religious affiliation. And this was seen as that, to a lot of people, it seemed like the United States was following in a distinctive way the earlier trajectory of Western Europe, where nations like France and the United Kingdom and countries in Scandinavia became very, very secularized. America had been different for a long time, but maybe now it was following the same path. So that was a story, a kind of social and cultural story that I lived with and wrote about, and if you were living with and writing about that story as a religious columnist, writing for a secular or liberal audience, you tended to have a kind of defensive cast where you were sort of explaining, you know, here's why you should still be interested in Christianity in spite of everything, right? That was sort of a tenor that a lot of writing in that period had. I would say in the last 5 or so years, that cultural landscape has shifted in some important ways. You can see that shift in the data, where the number of Americans with no religious affiliation rose and rose and rose and hit a peak somewhere in the COVID moment, and since then has sort of flatlined, maybe diminished a little bit, at the very least plateaued. So for now, the rise of the nuns has stopped. Doesn't mean that you have religious revival, but at least you have a break in the pattern of secularization. At the same time, you have, I think, a growing broad sense of what I would characterize as sort of anxiety and disillusionment surrounding the promises of narratives of secular progress. And you see versions of this on both the political right and the political left. They take different forms, but basically if you go back to the world of the new atheists, the world of 10 or 15 years ago, there was a very explicit promise made at that point by critics of religion that if you just got rid of religious belief, got rid of faith in the God of the Bible, you know, the ancient sky daddy sending down thunderbolts or, you know, whatever atheistic cliche you wanted to marshal, if you got rid of that, then the world would become more enlightened, less polarized, less paranoid and superstitious. Americans would find themselves, you know, feeling more congenial to their political opponents. Governance would improve, you know, down a long list of things that conspicuously have not happened at all in the 15 years since. So I think a lot of people have a sense, a reasonable sense, that we've sort of conducted an experiment in the promises of the critics of religion. And instead of yielding the broad sunlit uplands of a secular utopia, they've yielded a landscape characterized by anxiety, dismay, polarization, balkanization, increasing paranoia, proliferating conspiracy theories. People have walked away from religion and found, you know, distinctive forms of superstition to embrace in its place. People have developed apocalyptic hatreds for one another based entirely on politics, not on religion. And generally, I think especially among younger people, there is a kind of creeping despair at a world that lacks a kind of metaphysical horizon, lacks a sense of what human beings are for, what we're supposed to do with our lives, lacks a sense of like why human civilization is even worth continuing. And I'll come back to that idea a bit at the end of the talk. And obviously I think this has all been shaped in many ways by technological change, by digital life. I think 15 years ago there was a lot of optimism about what the internet and digital life meant for the culture and meant for politics, and now there's a lot of pessimism associated with social media, phones, and everything else. I think there's further forms of pessimism hanging in the shadows around the rise of artificial intelligence. Again, I'll come back to that at the end. But out of this, I think you're getting a kind of cultural reconsideration of religion and religious ideas. And the line that I like to use is, America is not having a religious revival, but we're considering whether we might like to have a religious revival. We're open to the possibility. I don't know exactly how long this openness will last, but I think it is a very distinctive feature of our moment that's different from certainly past moments in my own professional journalistic career. And one of the notable things about it is that it is, I think, right now, most significant, most notable in elite culture, in journalism, in prominent universities, places that you think of as sort of the bastions of secularism. Of course, not the University of Richmond, but other universities, more godless ones out there elsewhere in the country. And it's in those places, I think, where you see, again, not like, radical sweeping revival, but just clear upticks in younger people going to church, considering conversion, reading religious literature, having religious debates, and so on. And again, I think all of this is born out of a sense of disappointment and dismay with where a kind of post-religious cultural trajectory has landed us. And this, by the way, this interest does not just manifest itself in interest in Catholicism or Protestantism or Christianity or Judaism. There's sort of a free-ranging spiritual impulse in our culture right now that fastens on a lot of different things, right? You can see it. There's a kind of 1970s style revival of interest in, New Age stuff, psychic phenomena. One of the most popular podcasts in America right now is called the Telepathy Tapes, which is, where someone is, essentially doing research and making claims about autistic children having psychic powers, right? Like these kind of expressions of religion or sort of supernatural ideas and impulses are very prevalent in the culture, sort of detached a bit from religious institutions. If you go into, my local Barnes & Noble in southern Connecticut, which is, part of the Northeast, one of the more secular parts of the country, and you go into the religion and spirituality section, there used to be a few shelves for Christianity, a shelf for Judaica, a bunch of shelves for self-help, the shelves for Amish romance novels, of course, very important, and then like maybe one shelf for magic, that magical paraphernalia. Well, now it's 3 shelves, or maybe 3 columns, or maybe 4 columns of tarot cards and, goddess magic and these kind of things, right? So that kind of like almost neo-pagan impulse is out there. There's a renewed interest in UFOs, which is a place where, which is somewhat shared in part by myself, I'm sort of embarrassed to admit, but you can read my uncertain columns about that if you Google them up. But that is an example of like the blurry line between science fiction, myth, supernatural, paranormal. Again, there's a lot of interest there. And then AI itself is sort of haunted by and representative of kind of quasi-religious ideas and yearnings, fear of an apocalypse and the end of the human race, hopes for some kind of quasi-supernatural marriage of human minds and machines. There's a lot of sort of crazy religious energy in various ways circulating around Silicon Valley right now. And again, a way that is quite different from the world of, let's say, a figure like Bill Gates, who had no crazy religious energy circulating around him at all, as far as I can recall, in the 1998 or something. So that's an attempt to describe the landscape into which I'm trying to make a case for religion. And the book that I ended up writing is sort of very explicitly addressed to people who are sort of coming of age in this landscape, who may have kind of an attenuated connection to religion, or might have a sense that it would be nice to be religious, but they don't know how. They haven't really sort of, they haven't had a kind of, profound introduction to Christianity through church or Sunday school or anything like that. They have a lot of uncertainty about what religious people even believe. They have a sense that religion might be psychologically beneficial, but to become religious, you have to leave behind science and reason and rationality and take some kind of leap into pure faith alone, where you're sort of inherently in conflict with what science and reason might tell you about reality. So I feel like there's a lot of people in our culture sort of hovering at the threshold of religious belief or religious ideas. And so I set out to write a book that would be helpful to people in that position. And so some of the book is an argument about, if you decide there might be a God, how might you, but you haven't had a sort of personal encounter with that God, with, Jesus Christ or the Holy Spirit or any other divine manifestation, what do you do? Like, there's so many religions in the world. How might you go about sort of investigating them? How might you go about thinking about which one might be true? So part of the book is sort of saying, in fact, religion is like any other area of human affairs, something that it's something that contains mystical and personal elements, but if you haven't had the mystical encounter, if you haven't developed the personal relationship yet, it's still possible to sort of reason about what would it mean to try and be religious? What would it mean to seek and read and pray and try and figure out what might be out there? So that's sort of the self-help part of the book. But I want to give you a little more elaboration on the sort of straightforward argument part of the book, because the straightforward argument part of the book is basically trying to set out to establish, we'll say claim that the idea that was so powerful 15 or 20 years ago, that modern science and modern experience have made religion and religious ideas and a religious framework obsolete, is not just wrong, but arguably entirely backward. And that, in fact, many of the developments that are incredibly modern that we've experienced, developments in science, philosophy, the sociology of religion, the persistence of religious experience over the last 75 to 100 years have actually, in certain ways, strengthened the case for a religious approach to reality, strengthened the case that whatever your particular theological commitments, you should think, the universe probably exists for a reason. There's probably some being we should call God. The supernatural probably exists. And these are things, obviously, that many, many Americans believe, but they are not at all the defaults of elite intellectual culture. And I'm suggesting that maybe they should be the defaults of elite intellectual culture. I haven't yet succeeded in persuading that culture completely, but that's the argument that I'm trying to make. And let me just give you a few sort of case studies in what I'm suggesting, right? So start with kind of the level of the cosmos and our understanding of, what form the universe takes and how we stand in relation to it. I think for a long time there was an understandable sense, but by showing how vast the universe was and how small and insignificant seeming human beings and planet Earth stood in relation to that vastness, that science was downgrading the possibility that the universe had been made in any sense for us, that we were in any sense special, or that there was any kind of conscious plan at all behind reality. I would say that many of the developments in physics and cosmology since the early 20th century have effectively given back to us what earlier scientific discoveries and arguments seemed to take away. Strong evidence of intentionality and design that implicates us, human life, human consciousness, in the reasons why the universe exists in the first place. And there's a number of examples of this, but I would just, one that, an argument that you may have heard before, but I think deserves particular attention and greater elaboration, is just not just the evidence, but the basic scientific consensus that the architecture of the universe, the various sort of structuring forces, the constants, the mathematical rules, the different things that hold different forces together, in our universe seem incredibly precisely fine-tuned to allow for the kind of world that would yield solar systems, galaxies, planets, complex life, and us. And when you say fine-tuned, you don't mean like, there were 100 possible universes, and we got the one out of that 100 that would yield this kind of reality. It's more like there were a trillion possible universes, and 99.9 to the trillionth power of them would be lifeless, empty, or would immediately collapse in on themselves, and so on. And ours is a 1 in a trillion shot. It is so unlikely as to be effectively impossible to imagine without some kind of structuring conscious intentionality behind it, something like what theologians and philosophers have traditionally thought of as the mind of God. And we've ended up, I think, because of this, in a curious place in scientific and philosophical argumentation, where the alternative to accepting that there is some kind of intentionality, some kind of fine-tuning that yielded a universe precisely calibrated to enable us to come into being and exist in it. The alternative to this is the idea that, in fact, a trillion possible of those possible universes all in fact exist, that we are just one insignificant piece of an infinite multiverse. And by the way, we can never measure or reach or, sort of test the existence of all of these other universes. You just have to assume that they exist because the only alternative is to go back to belief in God. I think this is a peculiar place for non-religious science and philosophy to have ended up. I don't think that I can absolutely persuade anyone that, given the choice between one divine intentionality and an infinite number of invisible to us universes, that you have to choose the divine intentionality. But at the very least, I think we've entered into a place where the claim that atheism has this sort of obvious scientific theory behind it, and the religious are engaged in sort of wild metaphysical speculation, has basically been reversed. And it is the atheists now engaging in wild metaphysical speculation to avoid the concrete, very material evidence that the world was structured by someone for some purpose that seems to include us. So that's one example of the arguments I make. A second example is arguments around the nature of human consciousness. First, the resilient mystery involved in conscious experience, in explaining why human beings are not just sort of automatons, robots responding to stimulus with sort of automatic responses that enable us to reproduce and so on, but carry with us this sort of direct, seemingly, sort of extremely difficult to materially explain experience of ourselves as beings with intentionality and will and reason and the capacity to stand outside ourselves and analyze and understand. That's sort of one level of the mystery. The next level of the mystery is that this capacity that we have turns out to be marvelously fitted to understanding the larger structure and laws and realities of the cosmos, right? So it's like the first bonus is consciousness itself. You can imagine a world, and in fact we may end up building one through AI of robots running around, of sort of entities that move through the universe and survive and reproduce, but have no internal consciousness, that are effectively just zombies. You can imagine that universe, and it seems simpler and more parsimonious than the one we have, which has this extra thing, consciousness. And then, by the way, this extra thing, consciousness, turns out to be able to penetrate profoundly into the mysteries of the universe, to understand not just like how to survive in the African savanna or whatever else you might expect evolutionary fitness to generate, but also to penetrate deep into the laws of physics, to split the atom, to understand the human genome, to build artificial intelligence, to do all manner of extraordinary things. And my suggestion to the reader and then to you is that this combination of sort of unusual, hard to explain conscious experience and a capacity of that consciousness to understand and create is what the Bible means when it describes human beings as being made in the image of God. That our minds, it's not just that we have evidence that some kind of mind created the world and set it in motion. We have evidence in our own minds that we have some kind of relationship to that higher mind, that we do at a lower level versions of what we call God does at a higher level. And by the way, if you want to get even weirder, and of course you do, and delve deeper into the realm of quantum physics that our mysterious minds have unpacked, at the bottom level of reality, it appears, this is subject to great scientific contestation, but it appears that there is some profound and mysterious relationship between mind and matter, where mind itself, observation itself, is part of what causes contingency to collapse into reality. That reality, absent conscious observation, is a set of sort of mathematical possibilities that only become definite realities when we're there to observe it. I think some of the implications of that reality for belief in God, belief in the mind as a supernatural entity, belief in the mind as something that doesn't just emerge from matter, but stands in a kind of a priori relationship, which is what the religious argument has always suggested. That argument just looks a lot stronger in light of that weirdness than it did 100 years ago. So those are two examples. Then finally, let's get even weirder. A final reality of the last, really not just the last 100 years, but the last couple hundred years, is the incredible resilience and persistence and even expansion of religious, mystical, and supernatural experiences, meaning everything from, sort of experiences that people have, sort of mild experiences of oneness with the universe that people experience in meditation and prayer, to more transformative experiences, radical experiences, speaking in tongues, all the way through reports of miraculous occurrences, near-death experiences, and so on. This is all, in certain ways, the fundamental raw material of religion. Like if you ask, why does religion persist? It's not really because of theological argument. It is to some extent because people want meaning and purpose in life. But if you did away with all organized religions tomorrow, you would get religion back first and foremost because people would keep having weird religious experiences that seem to bring them in touch with higher powers and would want, explanations for that, would want systems that tell them, okay, what do you do with this experience? And there was a pretty strong expectation, if you go back and read the new atheists of the late 1700s, that once you got rid of established churches and stopped making people read the Bible and, stopped telling them that they had to believe in God, that a lot of this stuff would just go away. Yeah, there'd still be probably some, people would still think they saw Mother Teresa's face in a piece of toast or something. That would never quite go away. But the stuff that's, the stuff that's in the Bible, the miracles and wonder working, that would go away because that was all mythological. The experience of sort of transformation and sort of ecstasy, religious ecstasy. These things were the fruits of superstition and enforced religion, and if you did away with those things, they would go away. Nothing like that has happened. Religious experience has persisted, has flourished, has spread. There's some evidence, honestly, that more people have religious experiences in the early 21st century in America than they did in the 1950s when more people went to church. So even if even if fewer people go to church, that just seems to sort of set some of these experiences loose from the kind of systems of organized religion, and people just keep on having them. So at the very least, that is a point for religion against a sort of strict narrative of secularism, that this is the persistence of religious experience is something that religious people would have expected, atheists of the 1700s didn't expect, and the religious were right. But you can say more, you can say a bit more than that, right? You can say that there are certain mystical and supernatural seeming experiences that we actually know more about and can study more as science advances, right? So to take an example like near-death experiences, you get a lot more near-death experiences, it turns out, as medical progress advances and you bring more people back from the brink of death. So science and material progress and sort of technological progress yield a proliferation of intense experiences at the brink of death that people come back and don't necessarily know what to make of, but that turn out to have certain commonalities across cultures, certain persistent features that are incredibly difficult for a strictly materialist account of consciousness and the brain to explain or make sense of. And again, does this 100% prove the existence of God or that when you die, you'll go to heaven or purgatory or hell or anywhere else. No, it does not 100% prove that. But what it is a point, another point in favor of the religious perspective on the world. If we had developed incredibly advanced medical technology and started bringing more and more people back from the brink of death, and no one had near-death experiences. Everyone came back and said, I just had, a jumble of hallucinations, or, I just sort of went into the dark and then my consciousness turned back on and that was it. If that was what had happened, then every serious atheist would say, well, we told you so. Of course, yeah, there's no life after death, and you can tell because people die and come back and never report anything. Okay, fair enough. So in this world, where we have an increasing and expanding literature on near-death experience, again, across cultures and countries and religious contexts, you have to say that without, you don't have to be fully convinced, but the case for religion has gotten stronger. And out of these different elements, changes in how we think about cosmology and the order of the universe, shifts in how we think about consciousness, the resilience of religious experience, what you end up with, again, is not a world where there is a single slam dunk argument for being religious, where you read Thomas Aquinas and you come to like the third proof for the existence of God and you say, that's it, he's settled the debate, it's all over. Or at least if there is that level of proof, I'm not quite competent to offer it to you or maybe to understand it. Instead, what there are converging lines of evidence in different domains of human life, scientific, psychological, personal, sociological, that in each case you can come up with a non-religious explanation. You can say it's the multiverse over here. You can say supernatural experience is just a sort of evolutionarily conditioned set of illusions woven by the mind. And then you move over to consciousness and you have to say, well, except that the mind doesn't really exist. And you run into some trouble putting these things together, but you can try. But what you need is just a different explanation for each line of evidence. Whereas the basic religious perspective that says the world was set in motion for a reason, human lives are intended, and the forces that they participate in some way in the forces that set the universe in motion. And by the way, the forces that set the universe in motion are interested in some kind of relationship with us, and you should occasionally reach out to them, say a prayer here and there at the very least. Even better, maybe go to church. That perspective on the world is more parsimonious. It's simpler. It makes sense of all of the lines of argument instead of requiring you to sit over here positing a trillion other universes we can't see and sit over here trying to come up with some complex evolutionary argument for why it was adaptive to have near-death experiences. It's just a simpler argument. It is an argument that basically says the world that we live in multiple dimensions looks like the kind of world that not just Christianity, but a lot of the major world religions describe from the beginning. A world ordered and designed and intended with natural realities and supernatural realities and human beings standing in relationship to both. So that's, a very brief, but probably overly dense and slightly peculiar explanation of the argument that I make for why a serious, modern, 21st century person should treat religious ideas as sort of part of the architecture of how they approach the world, and treat them as a kind of baseline and a starting point from which you can then build up and say, okay, if there is a God, I'm going to seek a personal relationship with God. Or if there is a God, I'm going to, read sacred scriptures and read religious arguments and try and figure out which of the different religious worldviews seem truest, right? It's not, what I'm offering is not a complete world picture. It's a foundation that Western culture used to have, that people of different faiths, different forms of Christianity used to share in common, that has sort of fallen away under various pressures over the last couple of centuries, but that I think it is intellectually serious and rigorous to rebuild. That it is a foundation of ideas about the world that map onto reality and describe reality better than the skeptical and atheistic and purely materialist explanations. That's the basic argument in the book. But then let me add, to conclude, one further argument that is less sort of, yeah, less scientific or philosophical exactly, and more practical and aimed at the landscape that we're entering into as a species right now. I mentioned earlier and said I'd come back to just the sense that kind of digital culture has left people feeling often kind of isolated, disconnected, uncertain about what it means to be a human being, what a good life looks like, and even what human beings are for. And I think that, in effect, there's a sense of sort of, under digital conditions, a sense first that, you know, you have these kind of simulated substitutes for actual reality, sort of digital friendships that are like real friendships, but maybe not as effective at delivering the goods of friendship, simulated relationships that are not the same thing exactly as falling in love and getting married, simulated political or religious or ideological allegiances that are just thinner than ones that are put together in the real world. So that's sort of the phase of history that we've been living through, where sort of basic human institutions, churches, families, schools, even like shopping malls, right, are sort of being partially replaced by kind of simulated experiences of the same thing. And now, through artificial intelligence, we're increasingly going to be able to simulate human personalities, human characters, and what will appear as sort of human persons themselves. And I think this already and increasingly is going to create a tremendous sense of what you might call human obsolescence, a sense among a lot of people that they're not sure of, you know, what makes an actual human life worth living, what we're supposed to do in the world, and it's going to combine potentially with incredible levels of material abundance, digital entertainment, addictive forces of all kinds, and it's just easy to see a future, and I think you can already see it all across the world in the weakening of institutions, the decline of the family, the decline of marriage, and then the decline of birth rates that is setting some of the richest countries in the world on a path to kind of extinction. I think you're seeing, you might call it an evolutionary bottleneck, in a way. A bottleneck, right, is a set of pressures that you have a large population, a set of pressures hit, maybe it's a change in the environment, maybe a meteor strikes, and a smaller number get through the bottleneck into whatever world awaits on the other side. I think that's what, under digital and then AI conditions, humans and human cultures are going to go through. And everyone is not going to make it. Institutions are not going to make it, churches are not going to make it, countries, cultures, languages, people, all kinds of things are not going to make it. And as long as the robots don't try and kill us all, it won't be violent. They might try and kill us all, but that's a separate talk, right? It won't be violent, but it will be this pressure where you basically, to get through the bottleneck, you have to live intentionally in areas where our ancestors might have lived automatically. You can't just sort of rely on institutions and tribes and communities to carry you through, because those institutions and tribes and communities are weakening and falling away. You have to be the institution or the tribe or the community yourself in this very conscious way. You can't rely on the culture to sort of produce great movies and great books, because, you know, AI is just going to produce sort of a river of slop that everyone's going to be swimming in. And if you want the book, you have to, you know, sit down and write it or read it or make your kids read it yourself. Otherwise, you can just sort of be carried off in the flood. And the same applies to the most basic things: marriage, family, sex, kids, things that, again, were sort of unchosen automatic parts of human life for most people in most times, are only going to happen intentionally under these conditions. And so in that world, the practical case for religion, which, again, is connected to but not the same as the case that religion is true. They're connected, but it is somewhat different. But the practical case for religion is that it is a fundamental tool of human survival to believe that you have a divine purpose and a set of obligations that transcend your immediate material needs and indeed connect you in some way to the entire architecture of the universe, and that in fact it matters to God and the universe, not just to yourself or your family, whether your culture survives, whether you yourself survive, whether human beings flourish or disappear, that all of these things matter tremendously, and that for that reason, it is really important to be intentional, to make that choice, right? In the Bible, God says, I have set before you life and death. Choose life that you and your descendants, I'm mangling the line, but you and your descendants may flourish. And that is, I think, the very concrete and specific choice that the age of the internet and the age of AI is going to present to human beings across a really wide range of experiences and cultures and so on. And the sense that this is a moment when God is speaking and sort of offering those choices to human beings, I think that sense is one of the most powerful forces that will enable, hopefully, all of us in this room and everyone I know to get through this bottleneck to whatever awaits human beings on the other side. So, on that note, thank you so much for listening.
Okay, we have a few questions. Kalina.
Hi, thank you so much. Perfect. Thank you so much for your speech and for all the time that you spent with the students. We really appreciate it. I was wondering, why have faith communities lost young people, and what do you think religion has to offer for them in particular?
I mean, I think there is a normal pattern in human life to some degree where, at least in American culture, right, where there's some inevitable drifting away from religious community when you are sort of finding your footing as an adult in the world. That college creates some of these dynamics, high school creates some of these dynamics. Not all young people, but many young people have an impulse to sort of separate themselves to some degree from their family, and religion tends to be connected to sort of rootedness and settledness and sort of, sort of ideas about family and marriage. Like there's sort of a traditional pattern in American life where church going diminishes in your teens and 20s and then rises again in your 30s and 40s, right? So to some degree, part of what is notable about this era is not like just, all the young people have fallen away from religion. It's that the patterns through which young people find their way back to religion have sort of diminished or been closed off as pathways to adulthood in general have been closed off. So I think that is one story you can tell that's sort of separate from ideas and ideology and is just more about sort of like how people relate to institutions. The way people relate to institutions has changed, and that's changed the pathways for young people and young adults. I do think, though, also that young people came of age, younger people, younger millennials, Generation Z, and so on, came of age in the era that I described at the start of my talk, where you had sort of an end point for a particular religious culture in America, where it seemed to kind of run out of gas, take a lot of blows from critics, have a lot of internal scandals and so on, right? And so there is, I think, among young people, or has been up until this period, just, a sense that sort of religion belongs to the past and it's obsolete in various ways, right? And that maybe especially that institutional religion has that character, right? So there is, I think, like in some of the dynamics I was describing, the interest in astrology or UFOs or magic or whatever, there's also a sense that like, well, we're not going to go back to church or Christianity. We're not sure that like there's a capital G God, he's so high up or far away, right? But maybe like those lamps hanging in the room, there's these intermediate powers, right? And maybe they'll speak to us, maybe they'll help us, spirits, angels, you know, whatever you meet when you take ayahuasca, like these kind of things. And so I think one challenge for institutional religion in that kind of moment is to sort of recognize that like you have a lot of young people who are interested in spiritual questions, but struggle to imagine that the old institutional forms of religion could have the answer. And it would be a longer talk to talk about what those institutional forms should do. But that's one way to think about the landscape.
Thank you so much again for being here. I echo what Kalina said earlier. In your book, you make a logical defense for religious belief. Is faith also a valid ground for religious belief, or does it need to be based on reason?
I think that faith and reason should exist ideally in relationship to one another. And that doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean exactly that you would say faith is based on reason, right? But like, imagine, this is a very imperfect analogy, so I apologize, right? But imagine that you are, you know, in love with someone, right? And the love, the feeling that you have for that person and the feelings that they manifest towards you and the nature of that relationship in this sort of immediate flush of true love, that's all you need, right? You don't need some sort of sociological theory of how men and women should relate to one another, or, you know, a sort of understanding of the institution of marriage, or, you know, anything like love is the core thing, and it is distinct from and over and above any kind of sort of reasoning about you know, what is going on. And in the same way, you know, when Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic philosopher, was nearing death, he supposedly had a vision, you know, and he'd written endless books, far longer than mine, about like how to reason about God. And he had a vision where he came back from it and said something like, you know, all my work is as straw compared to the primary experience of God. I think that's, in the end, that's the right way to think about it, right? The thing that you want as a religious person, like the love you might feel for, you know, a spouse or even fiance or a boyfriend or girlfriend, right? It's supposed to be, it's higher than and above the reasoning that you do about it. At the same time, like, let's say you're not in love, you know, haven't found the right person, you haven't experienced love, right? Like, do you just sort of, you know, sit around and say, well, if love exists, it will come to me eventually. It will, you know, my future husband will walk into the room one day and I'll just know it instantly. Yeah, I mean, maybe that will happen. Love at first sight is possible. But having sort of, you know, having some reasoned thoughts about what is marriage, what are men and women like, what kind of dating culture works, what kind of decisions you might make to put yourself in a position to fall in love. Like, all that's good. There's nothing wrong with that, right? And that is sort of the kind of the structure on which, in some cases at least, the ultimate experience ends up being based. And I think something is somewhat similar of religion. For people who have a profound faith, maybe you don't need the structure, but you never know. Tomorrow you might have a crisis of faith. Then it might be good to have a structure of reason underneath where you say, even though I suddenly doubt God's existence or doubt God's love for me, I still have some good reasons to think he probably exists, and I shouldn't just, you know, give in to nihilism and despair. That's sort of what the benefit for the person who already has faith or already has the relationship. When times get tough, it's a foundation underneath. And then for someone who doesn't have faith but thinks there might be a God, then it's like the ladder that you climb, right? You say, well, I want, you know, if I'm going to go in search of God, I want to have some good reasons for doing it, and I want to have some sort of reasonable thoughts about, you know, what it might mean to try and be religious and where God might be found and so on. So that's, I don't know, that's an imperfect way of thinking about the relationship. But I think that saying that, saying faith alone is a bit like saying love alone, when in fact, for most people, that relationship is going to exist in the context of systems and structures that are informed by reason and informed by sort of a rational understanding of the world.
Hi, Mr. Douthat. Thank you for going through our gauntlet of questions the last 2 days.
Almost
but
done.
I can't let you go. I can't let you go until you answer mine, though. So here's my question. As a Christian, I worry that in an attempt to promote religion generally, we may overlook the inherent tensions that may exist between religions that are mutually incompatible. And in particular, I wonder how Christians like you and I can encourage people to practice and to pursue religions, any major religion, when we have the verses in the Bible like Galatians 1:8, in which Paul says that even if we or an angel from heaven were to preach a gospel contrary to the one that we preach to you, let him be accursed. Very strong language.
Yes. I think that there is a difficult balancing act under conditions of pluralism. And we live under conditions of pluralism, and we're likely to live under those conditions for as long as American society survives in its current form. On the one hand, if you are a serious religious believer, at the core of the most important religious traditions are serious claims that are incompatible with one another, right? Either Jesus rose from the dead, or he didn't. Either Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, or he isn't. Either the Buddha discovered the core path to enlightenment, or he didn't. Either Joseph Smith met the angel Moroni, or he didn't, right? And in a general belief like the one that I've expounded to you, that a general religious perspective on the world is something that rational people should share, you don't want to efface or ignore the fact that in the end, at the end point of any religious journey is some kind of decision about which religious faith on these core questions is right, and how you judge that decision should absolutely determine, like you should try to figure out which religion is true, and you should practice it. And when you're practicing it, you should assume that sort of core elements in other religions that fundamentally conflict with your own are not in the end the work of God. At the same time, it is clearly in some sense the will of God that there should be a lot of religions in the world. Why that's the will of God, how that interacts with human sin and human fallenness is sort of, it's a big theological debate, but this is the world we're living in, right? We're living in a world where you or I are, tomorrow not going to do away with the reality of pluralism. And that reality requires people to live in harmony and community with one another, live peacefully with one another, not try to oppress one another, treat each other with respect and decency. And I think one helpful way to think about why one should do that, it's not the only reason, is to recognize that even though there are these points of profound incompatibility between the great world religions, there are also fundamental points of commonality, things that they believe and share in common. And St. Paul also talks about that when he speaks to the pagans, right? He says something to the effect of, even before this gospel came along, the knowledge of God in some way was already present to you. And I think it's okay for Christians who believe in the exclusive truths of Christianity to also say that there are truths about God and the universe that people in other religions correctly hold. It's not the full truth, but they apprehend those truths as well, and that provides some common ground for dialogue and argument and debate, and yes, the possible ability of conversion, but that recognizing that is part of what makes sort of toleration and life under pluralist conditions workable. And it also allows for, I think, certain kinds of reasonable fellow feeling in debates about questions like, does human life have a purpose at all? Which, is a very fundamental question that lots and lots of people are being confronted with right now. And in debates about that question, I'm happy to stand in solidarity with people who do not share my Christian faith, but share a sense that the answer to that question is yes. So.
Well, thank you, Ross. Before I turn it over to Dean Peart, I do want to thank one other person. That's Luis Perales, who's also on our board of advisors, and actually suggested to us that we invite Mr. Douthat to the campus, and I would say that was a smashing success.
I mean,
yeah. So as Dean Peart makes her way to the podium, would you join me one more time in thanking Mr. Douthat?
thank you guys so much.
Mr. Douthat almost tripped over the box that I'm now standing on. I'm Sandra Peart. It's wonderful to close this program. Terry and Dan invited me to do so, and it's my pleasure. You'll notice that Mr. Douthat is leaving right now. He must leave quickly. We have worked him very hard, as has already been remarked. But please join me one more time in thanking Mr. Douthat. I should let you know that there are 14 copies of his signed book in the lobby that you may purchase if you're able to. But I'd like to say a few more words just before we lose everyone and move to the reception, which will soon follow. Growing up in Stratford, Ontario, I was admonished by my mother to talk to other people about the weather. We can all talk about the weather, and we rarely disagree about it. But I soon realized that we need to talk about things that we do disagree about, like beliefs or religion. And I'm grateful to the McDowell Institute for preparing our students and the rest of us to be able to have those kinds of conversations. I'd like to thank Brenda McDowell for establishing an endowed fund that helps support the Institute in perpetuity. I would be remiss if I didn't let you know that we're trying to build this endowment so that it will eventually replace the funding, the very generous funding that we now have from several grants. And I'd like to remind you that on April 8th and 9th, the university will be having its Giving Day. If you click on the Jepson School's website, you'll see that there's a drop-down and there's something that says the McDowell Institute Endowed Fund. If you enjoy these events, and if you agree with me that the Institute's mission to educate students about speaking across differences is a good one, please consider making a gift to the McDowell Institute's endowment. We will put that support to very good and ongoing use. And thank you very much for considering this. Please now enjoy some more conversation and a reception. As you exit the pavilion, turn to your left, and I'm sure you'll have wonderful conversations. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks very much.